The dying pregnant woman's breathing had become shallow by the time the sad homeless beggar found her on the street. Not in some distant location, but directly outside the luxury apartment building where her husband had just kicked her out to move his mistress into the home she'd secretly been paying for all along. He made his decision in seconds, not because he had money to spare, but because watching someone die while he did nothing would destroy whatever humanity he had left. And he gave her all his money to save her, without knowing she was a secret trillionaire whose hidden wealth made his sacrifice both heartbreaking and ironic. The husband had calculated his betrayal perfectly, timing his pregnant wife's removal to coincide with his mistress's arrival. Never suspecting the woman he was discarding had built a $1 trillion empire while he was distracted by his affair and his mother's constant encouragement to find someone better. His mother-in-law had been poisoning the marriage for years, not with subtlety, but with direct mockery at every company gala she hosted through the family business. Events where she publicly humiliated her daughter-in-law in front of executives and clients who were too intimidated to intervene. The sad, homeless beggar's all his money amounted to $18 and some change, barely enough to get the dying pregnant woman into an urgent care facility. But his sacrifice created a debt the secret trillionaire would remember when she recovered and discovered everything about the man who'd saved her. When she survived what should have killed her, her husband was already introducing his mistress to his mother at private dinners. His mother was already planning the grandest company gala ever hosted to celebrate her son's better choice, and the entire family was completely unaware. The company they were celebrating no longer belonged to them. The mother-in-law's mockery had always been her signature at these galas, her cruel observations delivered with surgical precision to maximize humiliation. But every barb she'd ever directed at her daughter-in-law was about to become evidence of her own ignorance. When the gala arrived, the husband walked his mistress through the doors of the venue his mother had rented using company funds. His mother prepared her most public and devastating mockery yet, and the executive board assembled without any clue that the woman about to be mocked was actually the secret trillionaire who now owned everything, including the building they stood in. What the secret trillionaire did when her mother-in-law began mocking her at the gala hosted by her own company didn't just reveal the truth. It systematically destroyed the husband's life until he became homeless and bankrupt like the beggar who'd saved his wife, shattered his mother's empire so completely that everyone who'd witnessed her cruelty finally saw justice, left his mistress exposed as someone who'd chosen wrong, and repaid the sad homeless beggar's $18 sacrifice with something that defied comprehension. Could a dying pregnant woman really have hidden a $1 trillion empire from the husband who kicked her out? Would a sad homeless beggar's decision to give all his money to a stranger actually trigger the destruction of an entire wealthy family? And would a mother-in-law's mockery at the gala hosted by her own company become the exact moment she lost everything she'd spent decades building? This story reveals how genuine compassion from someone with nothing exposes the hidden power in someone presumed powerless, creating a cascade of consequences that proves cruelty always meets justice and kindness always finds reward. You'll discover that homeless individuals often possess more moral wealth than the financially rich, that abused spouses sometimes accumulate power in silence, that public mockery becomes public humiliation when the victim holds secret power, and that small sacrifices can trigger massive transformations. You will learn to never judge people by their current circumstances, understand that karma operates through unexpected human connections, and recognize that treating others with cruelty, especially in public, always eventually backfires in equally public ways. Thomas Reeves had been counting the same coins for 3 minutes, not because the math was complicated, but because once he gave this money away, he would have absolutely nothing left between himself and starvation. His fingers, cracked from weeks of exposure to November cold, trembled as they sorted the bills and quarters he'd collected from 5 days of standing outside the downtown financial district with a cardboard sign. $18.63 represented every moment of humiliation he'd endured from businessmen who tossed change at his feet rather than into his hands. Every ounce of dignity he'd sacrificed when he'd agreed to perform for tourists who wanted to see a homeless man dance for quarters. The morning had started like every other morning in the 6 months since he'd lost everything. His engineering job, his apartment, his belief that the world rewarded hard work and good character. But it was ending in a way he'd never anticipated. The pregnant woman had collapsed so suddenly that Thomas initially thought she'd been shot, the way her body crumpled against the marble facade of the luxury apartment building on Fifth Avenue. He'd been walking past the building's entrance, not because he had any business in that neighborhood, but because the restaurants in that district sometimes left better food in their dumpsters than the soup kitchen served downtown. When he'd heard the sound of her body hitting the ground, something in his chest had tightened, not with fear, but with a recognition he couldn't quite name. The recognition that he was watching someone experience the exact moment their life changed from before to after. The way his own life had changed the day his company had eliminated his position to cut costs. She was wearing clothes that had probably cost more than Thomas had earned in a month, back when he'd had a salary. A maternity dress in deep blue that made her condition obvious even from 10 feet away. Her skin had gone gray in a way that Thomas recognized from his father's final days in the hospital. That particular shade of gray that meant the body had decided to stop fighting. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that barely moved her chest, and there was blood. Not a lot, but enough to suggest something was very wrong with her pregnancy. The apartment building's doorman had noticed her collapse, had even taken 2 steps toward her, before apparently deciding that helping was someone else's responsibility and retreating back inside the climate-controlled lobby. Thomas had made his decision before his conscious mind had fully processed what he was seeing, his feet carrying him across the sidewalk, while his brain was still cataloging all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He had $18.63. He had no phone to call for help. He had no identification that would make any hospital take him seriously. And he had every reason to keep walking because getting involved with wealthy people's problems had never ended well for people in his position. His mother had always told him that poverty made you invisible to the rich until they needed someone to blame, and Thomas had learned that lesson through experience when his former employer had made him sign away his right to sue in exchange for 2 weeks of severance pay. The woman's eyes had opened when he'd knelt beside her, those eyes focusing on his face with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail, as if his features contained some critical information she needed to preserve before she lost consciousness completely. Her lips had moved, forming words that Thomas couldn't hear over the traffic noise, but he'd understood the essential message anyway. She was asking for help, the same way he'd asked for help from dozens of people who'd walked past his cardboard sign without acknowledging his existence. He'd understood in that moment that he had a choice that would define what kind of person he was going to be, now that he'd lost everything else. He could be someone who walked past dying pregnant women because helping would cost him his last $18, or he could be someone who gave everything to a stranger because some things mattered more than survival. "I'm getting you help," Thomas had said, his voice rough from disuse because he'd barely spoken to anyone in days. "Just hold on." The urgent care clinic 3 blocks away had almost refused to take her, not because they were cruel, but because the woman clearly needed a hospital rather than a clinic, and the receptionist had explained this with genuine concern in her voice. Thomas had pushed his entire $18.63 across the counter and said the only thing he could think to say, "This is all I have, but she's dying, and if you turn her away, I'll make sure everyone knows this clinic lets pregnant women die on their doorstep." The receptionist had stared at the crumpled bills, had stared at Thomas's face, and had made a phone call that Thomas couldn't quite hear but knew was saving the woman's life. What Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the dying pregnant woman's eyes had indeed been memorizing his face, and that she would remember him when she woke up in the hospital 3 hours later with questions about who'd saved her life. Rebecca Harrison woke up in a private hospital room that her husband didn't know she owned, connected to monitors that were tracking the baby who'd almost died because of stress her husband had deliberately inflicted. The nurses had told her about the homeless man who'd given his last $18 to save her life, had described his face with enough detail that Rebecca had already instructed her assistant to find him using the building's security footage from Fifth Avenue. Her husband, David Harrison, had kicked her out of their apartment exactly 4 hours before her collapse, not knowing that their apartment was actually one of 14 properties Rebecca had purchased using income from the investment empire she'd built while he'd been spending his evenings with his mistress, Amanda Pierce. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so devastating. David had handed her $40 that morning and told her it was more than generous, considering she'd contributed nothing to their marriage, completely unaware that his wife had been secretly running Meridian Capital, a trillion-dollar private equity firm that had just purchased his family's company, Harrison Global Enterprises. Rebecca had built Meridian over 7 years of marriage, working through nights when David claimed he was at the office, but was actually in hotel rooms with Amanda, using the isolation he'd imposed on her as cover to acquire companies across 17 countries. Her mother-in-law, Patricia Harrison, who'd spent those same 7 years mocking Rebecca at every company gala for being a simple woman from a simple background, had no idea that the daughter-in-law she'd tortured was now technically her boss, the silent owner of every asset Patricia had used to build her social empire. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from her attorney, Michael Chen, confirming what she'd already suspected. David had moved Amanda into the Fifth Avenue apartment within an hour of forcing Rebecca out, the same apartment Rebecca had purchased 2 years ago when David's company had been struggling, and she'd quietly prevented his family's bankruptcy by buying their debts through a shell corporation. The security footage Michael had attached to his message showed David and Amanda laughing in the living room, toasting champagne in celebration of what they clearly thought was their new beginning. Neither of them aware that the furniture they were sitting on, the champagne they were drinking, and the roof over their heads all belonged to the woman David had just discarded like trash. The flashback hit Rebecca without warning, the way trauma always did. She was suddenly back at the gala 3 months ago, standing in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, while Patricia Harrison had delivered her most vicious public mockery yet. Patricia had waited until the entire executive board was assembled, until every major client was holding champagne and listening, before she'd turned to Rebecca and announced to the room, "My daughter-in-law has such simple tastes. I bought her a genuine Hermes bag for her birthday, and she asked if it came from Target." Can you imagine? The room had erupted in polite laughter that barely concealed the cruelty, and David had smiled at his mother's joke rather than defending his wife, completely missing the fact that Rebecca had been on a phone call with the Sultan of Brunei minutes before Patricia's joke, finalizing a deal that would add another $40 billion to Meridian's portfolio. Rebecca had built her empire in the shadows David and Patricia had created, using their dismissal of her intelligence as camouflage for transactions they never thought to question. When David had forbidden her from working, claiming a wife of his status shouldn't need employment, she'd started Meridian Capital from their guest bedroom, using the maiden name Rebecca Cole on all corporate documents. When Patricia had mocked her for being hopelessly lost during business conversations at galas, Rebecca had used those same conversations to identify which Harrison Global clients were unhappy, which executives were considering leaving, and which competitors were planning moves against David's family business. Every insult Patricia had delivered had given Rebecca information. Every moment of David's neglect had given her time, and every assumption they'd made about her incompetence had given her invisibility. The baby kicked inside her, a reminder that she'd been building this empire not just for herself, but for the child David had never wanted, the child he'd suggested she get rid of when she'd told him about the pregnancy 4 months ago. Patricia had been even more direct, telling Rebecca at a private family dinner that bringing a child into this world when you have nothing to offer it is selfish, apparently unable to comprehend that her grandchild would inherit an empire that made the Harrison family fortune look like pocket change. Rebecca had smiled through that dinner, had nodded at Patricia's concerns, and had gone home to sign papers that transferred another major Harrison Global competitor into Meridian's portfolio, systematically surrounding David's family business with her own holdings like a chess player positioning pieces for checkmate. The nurse entered to check Rebecca's vitals, but Rebecca's mind was already 3 weeks ahead, already planning for the annual Harrison Global Gala that Patricia hosted every December to celebrate the company's founding. Patricia had built that gala into a social institution over 25 years, an event where Manhattan's elite gathered to see and be seen, where business deals were made over champagne and caviar, and where Patricia herself reigned like royalty over a kingdom she believed was unshakable. This year's gala was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 23 days away, and Patricia had already sent Rebecca an invitation with a handwritten note. "Do try to dress appropriately this time, dear. I know it's difficult for you, but appearances matter at my events." Rebecca looked at that invitation now, displayed on her phone screen, and made a decision that would change everything. She would attend the gala, she would bring the homeless man who'd saved her life as her guest, and she would let Patricia mock her one final time in front of everyone who'd ever watched and done nothing. What Patricia didn't know, what David and Amanda and the entire Harrison family didn't know, was that Rebecca owned Harrison Global now, had purchased it through a series of shell transactions that her lawyers had finalized while she'd been unconscious in the urgent care clinic, and that the gala Patricia was planning to host in her company's name was actually going to be hosted in a building Rebecca now controlled. The irony was perfect. Patricia would mock Rebecca at a gala thrown by Rebecca's own company, in a venue Rebecca owned, in front of executives who now worked for Rebecca, celebrating a family business that Rebecca had quietly absorbed. And when the mockery reached its peak, when Patricia had publicly humiliated her daughter-in-law in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle, Rebecca would reveal the truth in a way that would destroy not just Patricia's reputation, but David's entire existence. But first, she needed to find the homeless beggar who'd given his last $18 to save her life, because what she was planning would require a witness whose presence would make the symbolism impossible to ignore. David Harrison stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Fifth Avenue apartment, watching the city lights sparkle below, while Amanda wrapped her arms around him from behind. Neither of them aware that the woman who actually owned this view was currently orchestrating their destruction from a hospital bed 3 miles away. He'd spent the past 2 weeks in a state of euphoria that felt almost chemical, the rush of finally being free from a marriage that had felt like an anchor around his ambitions, free to be with the woman who actually understood his needs rather than the silent, simple wife his mother had always told him was holding him back. Amanda kissed his neck and whispered that she was proud of him for finally choosing happiness, apparently believing that abandoning a pregnant wife demonstrated strength rather than cowardice. His mother had thrown a private celebration dinner the night after he'd moved Amanda into the apartment, gathering the family at Le Bernardin to toast what Patricia had called David's fresh start with someone more suitable. Patricia had spent the entire dinner praising Amanda's sophistication, her business acumen from her marketing position at a mid-tier firm, her understanding of how our world works, all carefully constructed compliments designed to emphasize everything Rebecca supposedly lacked. David's father had remained silent throughout the dinner, his discomfort visible but unexpressed, a pattern that had defined the Harrison family for generations. Patricia made the decisions, delivered the verdicts, and everyone else simply accepted her judgments as reality. What David didn't know was that his father, Robert Harrison Sr., had received a mysterious phone call 3 days ago from a lawyer representing Meridian Capital, informing him that Harrison Global Enterprises had been purchased in a leveraged buyout that had happened so smoothly that Robert hadn't even realized his company was for sale. The lawyer had assured Robert that nothing would change in the immediate future, that current management would remain in place, and that the transition would be handled delicately to preserve company morale and family dignity. Robert had tried to investigate who owned Meridian Capital, but every search had led to shell corporations and offshore holdings that disappeared into legal structures too complex to untangle without months of investigation. He decided not to tell Patricia yet, not until he understood what was happening, because Patricia's reaction to losing control of the company she'd used as her personal kingdom would be catastrophic. Amanda had been planning their future with the confidence of someone who believed she'd won a prize, talking about the wedding they'd have once David's divorce was finalized, the honeymoon in Santorini, the children they'd raise in this apartment that she thought David owned. She'd already started redecorating, replacing Rebecca's simple, elegant furniture with pieces Amanda considered more sophisticated, spending money from David's accounts without realizing those accounts were rapidly depleting because his salary from Harrison Global was about to disappear when Meridian's restructuring began. David had encouraged Amanda's spending, had told her to make this place ours, never questioning why Rebecca had never cared about redecorating or why his formerly quiet wife had never asked for the credit cards he'd now given Amanda unlimited access to. The flashback that interrupted David's contentment came from a moment 3 years ago that he'd buried because it had contradicted his narrative about Rebecca. He'd come home early from a supposed business trip and had heard Rebecca on the phone in the guest bedroom, speaking in a voice he'd never heard her use before. Confident, commanding, negotiating terms for what sounded like a major corporate acquisition. He'd stood outside the door listening to her discuss the Dubai portfolio and the Singapore expansion with someone she'd called Michael, and when she'd ended the call, David had walked away rather than confronting her, because acknowledging that his simple, quiet wife might have a life he didn't understand would have complicated the story he'd been telling himself about their marriage. He'd convinced himself he'd misheard, that she'd been watching a business drama on television, anything except accepting that Rebecca might be more than what he'd assumed. Patricia, meanwhile, had been planning the annual Harrison Global Gala with an intensity that bordered on obsession, not because this year was particularly special, but because she wanted to debut Amanda as David's new partner in the most public way possible. She'd already had the invitations printed, elegant cards with gold embossing that announced Patricia Harrison requests the pleasure of your company at the 25th annual Harrison Global Gala, and had personally called each major client and executive to ensure they'd attend what she was privately calling a celebration of new beginnings. Patricia had selected the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom, the same venue where she'd humiliated Rebecca countless times, and had specifically planned a moment during her welcome speech where she would acknowledge David and Amanda's relationship with her blessing, a public coronation that would simultaneously celebrate Amanda and erase Rebecca from the family narrative. What Patricia had also planned, though she'd shared this only with her closest confidants, was a final humiliation for Rebecca if she dared to attend. Patricia had prepared remarks about women who try to climb above their stations and the importance of knowing one's place, comments designed to destroy whatever dignity Rebecca might have left after David's very public abandonment. Patricia had even practiced the delivery, timing her pauses for maximum impact, imagining the moment when the entire room would laugh at her jokes while Rebecca stood alone and powerless. Across town, Thomas Reeves was sitting in a hotel suite he didn't understand how to process, wearing clothes that felt like a costume, meeting with lawyers who kept calling him Mr. Reeves with a respect he hadn't heard directed at him in years. The woman he'd saved, who'd introduced herself as Rebecca when she'd found him sleeping in a subway station 5 days ago, had explained nothing except that she needed him to attend an event with her, that she would provide everything he needed, and that what she was planning would change both of our lives. Thomas had agreed because he had nothing to lose, and because something in Rebecca's eyes had reminded him of himself before he'd lost everything. The look of someone who'd been underestimated so completely that they'd become dangerous. Rebecca's assistant, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, who treated Thomas like he mattered rather than like he was invisible, had explained that he'd need to wear a tuxedo to the gala, that someone would help him prepare, and that his only job was to be present and be yourself. Jennifer had also slipped him an envelope containing $5,000 in cash with a note from Rebecca that read, "This isn't charity. This is a down payment on a debt I owe you. The rest comes after the gala." Thomas had cried in the hotel bathroom after reading that note, not because of the money, but because someone had acknowledged that his $18 sacrifice had created a debt rather than treating his help as something a homeless man should be grateful to provide. The gala was now 3 days away, and Rebecca had everything positioned exactly as she needed it. David believing he'd won his freedom, Amanda believing she'd won a prize, Patricia believing she controlled a company she'd actually lost, and Thomas positioned as a witness to what happened when cruelty finally met consequences. Rebecca had spent 2 weeks recovering from the collapse that had almost killed her and her baby, 2 weeks arranging for Meridian Capital's ownership of Harrison Global to be revealed at the precise moment that would cause maximum devastation, and 2 weeks allowing David and Patricia to celebrate their victory before showing them what victory actually looked like. The final piece had fallen into place that morning when Rebecca's lawyers had confirmed that Patricia had used company funds to pay for the gala venue, the catering, and all the elaborate decorations she'd planned, meaning Patricia had technically stolen from the company Rebecca now owned to throw a party where she planned to mock the woman who could have her arrested. Rebecca had no intention of pursuing charges, but the symbolism was perfect. Patricia would use Rebecca's money to celebrate Rebecca's humiliation, never realizing until it was too late that every dollar she'd spent had come from the woman she'd spent 7 years destroying. Rebecca stood in front of the mirror in her hospital suite, practicing the expression she would wear when Patricia launched her attack at the gala. The same neutral, accepting expression she'd worn through 7 years of mockery. The expression that would make her mother-in-law believe this humiliation was working exactly as planned. What Patricia wouldn't see until it was too late was that Rebecca's expression wasn't acceptance, but patience. The patience of someone who'd spent years positioning every piece on the board before making the move that would end the game entirely. The Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom would hold 400 guests on December 15th, every one of them about to witness what happened when the powerless turned out to be powerful, when the mock turned out to be the owner, and when mercy met cruelty in front of everyone who'd chosen silence over intervention. The Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom had never looked more beautiful or more ironic. 500 guests mingling beneath crystal chandeliers that sparkled above a celebration that was about to become an execution. Patricia Harrison stood at the center of the room in a gown that had cost $40,000, holding a microphone and surveying her kingdom with the satisfaction of someone who believed her power was absolute and permanent. David and Amanda stood near the front, his arm around her waist in a possessive gesture meant to signal ownership, both of them smiling at guests who'd come to celebrate what they thought was Harrison Global's continued success under Patricia's guidance. None of them had noticed the small changes in the room, the Meridian Capital logo subtly incorporated into the floral arrangements, the servers wearing pins that read MC in elegant script, the security personnel who answered to Rebecca rather than to Patricia's event coordinator. Rebecca entered through the side entrance exactly as Patricia began her welcome speech. Thomas beside her in the tuxedo that transformed him from invisible homeless man to distinguished gentleman, though his eyes still carried the wariness of someone who'd learned that good fortune could disappear in an instant. Rebecca had chosen a maternity gown in deep emerald green that made her pregnancy impossible to ignore, a deliberate choice that would remind everyone in the room exactly what David had abandoned and what Patricia had mocked. She'd also chosen to arrive late, not because she wanted to make an entrance, but because she wanted Patricia to be mid-speech when Rebecca's presence registered, wanted the interruption to be visible to everyone watching. Patricia saw her first, the microphone nearly slipping from her hand before she recovered with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades controlling rooms through force of personality. "Well," Patricia said, her voice carrying across the ballroom with false warmth that barely concealed her venom. "How unexpected. My former daughter-in-law has decided to join us this evening, despite no longer having any connection to this company or this family." The crowd's laughter was nervous rather than genuine, people sensing something beneath Patricia's words but not yet understanding what they were witnessing. David had turned pale, his arm dropping from Amanda's waist as he registered that Rebecca was not only present, but accompanied by a man he didn't recognize. A man who was looking at Rebecca with protective concern rather than romantic interest. Rebecca walked slowly toward the front of the room, not rushing, letting every guest get a clear look at her face and the man beside her, letting Patricia build toward whatever public humiliation she'd prepared. Patricia didn't disappoint, warming to her subject with the enthusiasm of someone delivering a performance she'd rehearsed. "I'm sure we're all curious about Rebecca's guest this evening. Have you found someone new already, dear? Someone more suited to your actual station in life?" The implication hung in the air like poison. Patricia was suggesting Rebecca had brought a homeless man to a society gala, was suggesting that Rebecca's standards had fallen to match her circumstances, was delivering what she clearly thought was a devastating blow to whatever dignity Rebecca had left. "Actually," Rebecca said, her voice quiet but somehow carrying to every corner of the ballroom without a microphone, "I'd like to introduce Thomas Reeves, the man who saved my life and my baby's life 3 weeks ago when I collapsed outside the apartment building where my husband had just kicked me out to move his mistress into the home I'd purchased. Thomas gave me his last $18, every cent he owned, to get me medical help, not knowing who I was or whether I could ever repay him." The room had gone completely silent, every guest now focused entirely on Rebecca's words rather than Patricia's performance. "I wanted Thomas here tonight because he represents something this room needs to remember, that character reveals itself in sacrifice, not in wealth, and that the people we dismiss as powerless sometimes possess more humanity than those of us who think we control everything." Patricia tried to regain control, her voice sharp with anger that she wasn't quite managing to disguise as amusement. "How touching. A homeless man with $18 and a discarded wife with delusions of significance? I'm sure you'll both be very happy together in whatever modest circumstances you—" "Harrison Global Enterprises was purchased 3 weeks ago by Meridian Capital," Rebecca interrupted, her voice still quiet but now carrying an edge that made several executives in the crowd straighten with sudden attention. "Meridian Capital is a private equity firm I founded 7 years ago, built from nothing while my husband was with his mistress, and my mother-in-law was mocking me at events exactly like this one. Every gala where you humiliated me, Patricia, I was between phone calls with heads of state and Fortune 500 CEOs. Every time David handed me $40 and called it generous, I was signing deals worth billions. Every assumption you made about my limitations became camouflage for an empire you never thought to look for." The devastation on Patricia's face was total, her carefully constructed expression crumbling into something raw and disbelieving. But Rebecca wasn't finished. "This gala was paid for with company funds, my company's funds, since I own Harrison Global now. This building belongs to a real estate portfolio I purchased last year. Every executive in this room works for me, though most of them didn't know it until this moment. And the apartment David moved his mistress into? I bought that 2 years ago when your family business was failing, and I prevented your bankruptcy through a shell corporation, because despite everything you'd done to me, I still loved your son enough to save him from the consequences of his family's incompetence." David had started shaking, his face transitioning from pale to gray as the implications hit him in waves. He'd kicked out the woman who'd saved his family. He'd mocked the wife who owned everything he'd thought was his. He'd celebrated freedom from a marriage where he'd actually been the dependent rather than the provider. Amanda had stepped away from him, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she realized she'd attached herself to a man who had nothing, a man whose wealth had always belonged to the wife he'd discarded, a man who was about to lose everything, including the apartment they'd been living in. "As of this morning," Rebecca continued, looking directly at Patricia now, "Harrison Global Enterprises has been restructured. The executive board has been replaced with people who earn their positions through competence rather than family connections. The company assets have been redistributed to eliminate the redundancies and nepotism that were destroying profitability. And the Harrison family's ownership stake, which you've used for decades to justify your cruelty to anyone you deem beneath you, has been eliminated entirely. You have no company, Patricia. You have no kingdom. You have nothing except the reputation you've built through 25 years of public mockery, and now everyone in this room knows exactly what you are." Patricia's collapse wasn't physical, but psychological, her body remaining upright while everything that had defined her identity shattered in front of 400 witnesses who'd spent years watching her cruelty and doing nothing. David stumbled backward, his hands reaching for support that wasn't there, his mind clearly racing through every moment of the past 3 weeks and realizing that every celebration had been built on a foundation that had already disappeared. Amanda was already moving toward the exit, her survival instincts apparently telling her to distance herself from the wreckage before it consumed her too. But Rebecca wasn't done, because the cruelty she'd endured required more than just exposure. It required karmic symmetry that would make the lesson impossible to forget. "David, the apartment you're living in belongs to me, and you have 72 hours to vacate it. I'm giving you exactly what you gave me. 3 days to find somewhere else to go with nothing but the clothes you can carry. Patricia, the properties you've used to maintain your social position are all mortgaged against Harrison Global credit lines that no longer exist, which means you're about to discover what bankruptcy feels like. And Amanda, the credit cards David gave you access to, they were connected to accounts that Meridian Capital controlled, which means every purchase you made over the past 3 weeks was technically made with my money. And I've documented every transaction for the civil lawsuit my attorneys will file tomorrow. The room remained frozen, 400 people watching 3 lives disintegrate in real time, watching karma operate with a precision that seemed almost supernatural in its justice. Thomas stood beside Rebecca, his presence serving as the moral anchor that made her revenge feel righteous rather than cruel. He represented what David and Patricia should have been but weren't, represented the choice to give everything for a stranger rather than taking everything from someone vulnerable. I'm offering Thomas a position as Director of Community Investment at Meridian Capital, Rebecca said, turning to look at the man who'd saved her life with his last $18. His job will be to identify and support people experiencing homelessness who demonstrate the kind of character he showed me. People who give when they have nothing, people who help when helping costs them everything, people who possess the moral wealth that this room has spent decades pretending doesn't matter. Thomas's eyes had filled with tears, his hand finding Rebecca's and squeezing it with gratitude that transcended words. Gratitude for being seen as fully human again after months of being treated as invisible. Patricia stumbled from the room without another word, her reign ending not with a dramatic exit, but with a silent retreat that was somehow more devastating than any scene she could have caused. David followed her, his posture that of a man who just realized he'd traded a $1 trillion empire for a mistress who was currently pretending not to know him. Amanda disappeared into the crowd, her face a mask of calculation as she clearly ran through her options and found them all catastrophic. The guests began whispering the moment the 3 of them were gone, phone cameras capturing everything for social media posts that would ensure this story spread far beyond the 400 witnesses in the ballroom. Rebecca had orchestrated the revelation for maximum exposure, understanding that public cruelty required public justice, that private revenge would never teach the lesson that needed teaching. The private hospital room overlooked Central Park in spring, cherry blossoms visible through windows that framed a view Rebecca had purchased not for its beauty, but for the memory it would give her children of their first moments in the world. Thomas sat beside her hospital bed, not as her husband. Their relationship had evolved into something deeper than romance, but different from traditional family, a bond forged through mutual rescue and shared understanding of what it meant to be underestimated and dismissed. But as the godfather to the 3 babies Rebecca had delivered that morning, triplets, the doctors had said with surprise, 3 perfect daughters who would inherit an empire their mother had built in shadows and revealed in light. Rebecca had named them Grace, Justice, and Mercy, names that represented the 3 forces that had shaped her journey from dismissed wife to secret trillionaire to public victor. Thomas had cried when she told him the names, understanding that she was teaching her daughters the lessons they'd both learned, that grace meant helping even when it cost everything, that justice meant exposing cruelty even when silence was easier, and that mercy meant choosing restoration over destruction when revenge was available. David had indeed become homeless within weeks of the gala, his descent mirroring Thomas's original journey, but without the character that had made Thomas worthy of rescue. Patricia had filed for bankruptcy within a month, her properties seized to pay debts she'd hidden through creative accounting that was now being investigated by federal prosecutors Rebecca had quietly informed about financial irregularities. Amanda had tried to sell her story to tabloids, only to discover that Rebecca's legal team had already documented every false claim she might make, neutralizing her leverage before she'd realized she needed it. Thomas's program at Meridian Capital had identified and supported 247 people experiencing homelessness in its first 6 months, providing not just money but opportunity, not just shelter but dignity. He ran the program with the zeal of someone who'd lived the nightmare and survived it, who understood that homelessness destroyed people not through lack of shelter, but through the systematic denial of their humanity by everyone who walked past without seeing them. Rebecca looked at her three daughters sleeping in their bassinets, looked at Thomas sitting vigil like the guardian he'd become, and felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years of marriage to David. Peace that wasn't contingent on pretending to be less than she was. Safety that wasn't dependent on making herself invisible. Hope that her children would grow up knowing their mother had chosen justice over silence, even when silence would have been easier. The story had gone viral exactly as Rebecca had intended. The Gala footage spreading across social media with hashtags like Karma's Real and Secret Trillionaire, teaching millions of viewers the lessons Rebecca had learned through suffering, that dismissing people based on circumstances was not just cruel, but stupid, that abused spouses sometimes accumulated power while appearing powerless, that public mockery always found public justice, and that $18 given with pure intentions could trigger consequences that reshaped entire worlds. Thomas would eventually marry, not Rebecca, but a woman he'd meet through the program, someone who'd also survived homelessness and understood what restoration meant. But he would remain bonded to Rebecca and her daughters through something deeper than romance, through the mutual recognition that they'd saved each other's lives in different ways, that his $18 had rescued her body while her revelation had rescued his dignity, and that their stories would remain intertwined forever through the triplets who would grow up calling him Uncle Thomas and learning that character mattered more than wealth, that compassion mattered more than status, and that the people society dismissed as powerless sometimes possessed the moral authority to reshape everything. David sent a letter 6 months after the gala, pages of apologies and explanations that Rebecca read once and then burned, understanding that his remorse was less about genuine transformation and more about wanting back what he'd lost. Patricia never apologized, her pride apparently stronger than her survival instinct, her silence serving as final confirmation that she'd learned nothing except that her cruelty had finally met consequences. Amanda disappeared entirely, her social media accounts deleted, her name disappearing from the circles she'd tried to infiltrate through David's family. The triplets, Grace, Justice, and Mercy, would grow up hearing the story of the homeless beggar who'd given everything to save their mother, would learn that their godfather had demonstrated more character in one moment of sacrifice than most people showed in entire lifetimes, and would inherit not just their mother's trillion-dollar empire, but the moral framework that had built it. That power meant nothing without compassion, that wealth meant nothing without generosity, and that victory meant nothing unless it included restoration for the people who'd been broken by the same systems that had created the wealth in the first place. Rebecca looked at Thomas and said the same thing she'd said to him in the hotel room before the gala. "You saved my life with $18. I'm spending the rest of my life making sure that sacrifice meant something bigger than just my survival." Thomas smiled, his expression carrying the peace of someone who'd found purpose after believing he'd lost everything, and replied with the wisdom he'd earned through suffering. "You didn't need me to save you. You were always powerful. I just reminded you that you weren't alone, and you reminded me that being powerless and being invisible aren't the same thing. We saved each other, Rebecca, and those 3 girls are going to save a whole lot more." The story ended not with revenge, but with restoration. Not with destruction, but with the building of something better from the ruins of what had been broken. Teaching viewers the ultimate lesson, that karma operated through human connection, that justice flowed from character rather than wealth, and that the moral universe bent toward people who gave their last $18 to dying strangers without expecting anything in return.